Hello everyone, this is Professor Kruger. I wanted to make a hopefully short video to just tie up some loose ends. It's not required that you watch this, but it will tie up some of the things that I was talking about earlier. One of the biggest things is how the CDC actually characterizes modes of transmission. And I placed a link to this website by the CDC where they actually talk about the whole chain of infection. And on the part of the site that comes after the portal of exit, see if that will reset here. So the part of the site that comes after the portal of exit is their section on modes of transmission. And it actually says in this section, there are different classifications for modes of transmission. Here is one classification. So like I was saying in one of the previous videos, there's no one way to talk about different modes of transmission. And this is part of the problem that we're facing now in how to describe the transmission of COVID-19. This idea of whether the virus is airborne or not is still a point of contention, and people are still talking about it, and the public health bodies are still going back and forth about whether they want to come out and say, yes, absolutely, the virus is airborne. So there's still this back and forth of what's going on there. What I wanted to do was I just wanted to show you a map of what the CDC's classification looks like. So again, this is not the only classification out there. In one of the previous videos, I did the classification based on what your textbook was saying. Personally, I like the CDC version better. I think that it is more clear and makes more sense. But again, there's no one right way to look at this. It's one of different ways of characterizing transmission. But just to take you through this, the CDC breaks this apart into direct versus indirect modes of transmission. Direct is broken apart into direct contact and droplet spread. Direct contact is what you would think of: skin to skin, mucous membrane to mucous membrane. Droplet spread. These are droplets that come out of a portal of exit, typically the nose or the mouth. They're quite large, and they tend to fall to the ground within a few feet. Typically, this is characterized as about less than or equal to 1 meter. That's only about 3 feet. Now with coronavirus, they're talking about 6 feet. So this can vary as well. But the idea is that this is droplet spread. The CDC even refers to this as a short range aerosol. That's another word that has gotten very confusing. But the idea is that these droplets come out of the portal of exit and they fall to the ground within a certain number of feet. When you look at the indirect forms of transmission, the CDC breaks this apart into 3 major categories. There's airborne, vehicle-borne, and vector-borne. Airborne, a couple of different possibilities. One is that you can have the infectious agent settled on dust particles, which can then be carried through the air. The second, which is what we're concerned about with COVID, are these smaller droplets that can dry up. They become known as droplet nuclei or dried droplets. They create more long-range aerosols, or sometimes you hear the word aerosol only used in this airborne way. The main point is that these can remain suspended in air for various periods of time, and they can be carried for various distances. So I'm going to go ahead and add that here. So the issue with the coronavirus right now is that, do we call it airborne or not? The evidence suggests that yes, you should call this airborne. What we don't know is how long are those droplets going to remain suspended in the air? If they are there, how infectious are they? Just because they're there doesn't mean that they're going to actually cause infectious disease. And how far can they be carried? And what goes into all of that? So this is the point of contention at this point, is whether we're calling this droplet spread and or airborne. Your book kind of combines those two into one category, which I think is problematic, especially given what we're going through right now with coronavirus. So this is really the difference, is are the droplets only spreading out over a short range within a few feet, or can they actually dry up, they become smaller, and then they can be carried for longer than a few feet, and they can be carried over periods of time. This is the big distinction between just droplet spread and airborne. If something's airborne, it sounds a lot scarier. So there are considerations about using the word airborne, even though the data really points to the fact that the virus can be airborne. The vehicle-borne, that basically means that the infectious agent is being carried by some kind of non-living thing, and it's being carried from the host to another host. So there's some kind of non-living in between the original host and then the new host that gets infected. So these vehicles can be different things. So food and water, those can be vehicles. Those can carry infectious agents from one person to another. Fomites, inanimate objects, are considered vehicles. Biological products are considered vehicles. So a vehicle is a general term for something that can carry the infectious agent from one host to another. A vector is what I had talked about earlier. A vector is usually an insect that can carry the infectious agent without itself actually getting a disease, entering into a disease state. Typically they're insects, and typically they're arthropod insects. So things like mosquitoes, ticks, flies. But they can also be other animals. So bats can be vectors of disease, rabies. So it's not necessarily an insect, but when we think about vector-borne transmission, we're usually thinking about insects. So this is the way that the CDC presents this. And again, I know that this is frustrating because the textbook is giving one presentation, the CDC gives another presentation. There is no one right way to go. But a really important consideration is for you to understand the difference between this short range droplet and the longer range droplet. That might be an easy way to look at that, but you also should be familiar with this terminology of the droplets versus the dried droplets. That's something that you're going to see quite a bit. So that is the CDC modes of transmission concept map. The other thing that I want to show you is on the Brightspace site in the section that says after you submit your lab activity assignments, there is a section that has a whole lot of additional resources. A lot of them. I'm just going to walk you through them a little bit so you know what's there. You do not have to look at any of these, but some of you may be interested, especially in some of the videos that are here because they are very good. There are a couple of sources on the naming of the actual virus. In one of the videos, I had talked about how the naming of viruses much more complicated than the naming of true living organisms. And just to give you a side-by-side comparison, this article has a graphic in it that is actually quite useful. So when you're looking at the naming of viruses, the categories start up in something called a realm, and then you have all these different categories until you finally get down to an individual. Well, an individual, let's call it that. And you can see side by side, this is the coronavirus taxonomy. This is a true living organism taxonomy. So you can see for the coronavirus, there are all these different names, and for the human being, there are fewer names. So it's a lot easier. But with viruses, it is more complicated. There is an international committee that actually comes up with all of this taxonomy based on genetic data of the virus. And if you're interested, there are a whole lot of details about how the naming process actually unfolded. So this is here for you if you want to go in and see more detail. The other resources here include just the general CDC site for the coronavirus, the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report site for the coronavirus. So this has the most updated official reports about coronavirus outbreaks and case studies. There are some examples of the early outbreaks that would point towards airborne transmission. And what I did was I included a popular article here, but then I also included the MMWR entry as well. So these are actually about the same outbreak. There was an outbreak associated with a restaurant near Wuhan, China, and this was way back in April. So if you take a look at both of these or either of them, there is really good evidence there that this virus can be airborne. Now you're going to see that they're talking about it associated with the air conditioning, but that still means that the air was blowing that virus around. So if you're interested, you can take a look. There's also another case outbreak here that happened early on in May at a chorus practice or choir practice in Washington State. So again, there's a general popular article here, and then there's the actual MMWR entry here. So you're welcome to take a look at either of those. There is an article, actually a couple of articles, about how the WHO has not come out and made a very strong statement about how the virus is airborne. And from July, this was the end of July, these are scientists that were telling the WHO that they really just need to say that it's airborne, but the WHO is still not making a very strong statement about that. Down here, I think these are some very good practical resources. This video that talks about how the coronavirus spreads, and it talks about outdoors versus indoors. It's 6 minutes. It's well worth your time. Very good. They also have a chart that goes along with that video that talks about the risks of different activities. This last video is excellent. It's 20 minutes, so it's definitely more of a time investment, but it is a fantastically done video about transmission of the coronavirus. It talks about these case studies that I've mentioned. It talks about other studies. It talks about studies involving different types of masks. It is really well done. So if you have the time, I really do recommend that you watch this. And we will be revisiting coronavirus throughout the semester, obviously, and we will have one whole class devoted to it. So at that time, I will bring up these resources again. But if you're interested, those are resources that you can use to do a deeper or have a deeper look at this point in time.